Good morning to you. 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 Oh, good morning to you. Ooh, ooh. Good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful day. I hope that those of you who are believers are paying attention to what's happening with the Supreme Court questioning on today. They are into the thick of it, and I am going to go back and watch some of the hearing that is happening. I'll probably catch it on the replay. So welcome this morning. For those of you who are new, this is Daring Dialogues, and I'm your host, Shantae Charles. On Thursdays, we cover theology, we cover philosophy, and we cover just getting you into the thought process, into your head. And we're sharing, right now, we are talking about the origins of Christianity in Africa, and also tying in the African American experience with Christianity here in the United States by looking at the work of James H. Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And we are going to pick up with Thomas C. Oden's book first, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, which talks about the origins of Christianity coming straight out of Africa, and the fact that it was not a European invention. So we are right in the middle of that, and we are in the chapter where we're talking about defining Africa. We're in chapter 3, and we're going to continue our talk. And today we're going to be talking about how the African seedbed hypothesis requires demonstration. And so the writer is going to talk to us about the path that Christianity took from Africa to Ireland to Europe and then back to Africa. And I did take a look at, I tried to do some research just to see what was out there about African fathers of the faith. And I Googled African church fathers. Good morning. I Googled African church fathers, and guess what? It only brought up things that were present day. It only brought up things that happened 1900s moving forward, and it talked about the Pentecostal movement. But there was not a whole lot of source work on the original Africans. And so this author is dead on when he talks about people want to erase the origins of Christianity coming out of Africa initially. I found it to be very surprising that most of the information out there makes it seem as if the history of Christianity started in Europe and then moved from there. It totally dismisses, as the writer here points out, much of the research out there totally dismisses the origins of Christianity coming out of Africa. So if you have incomplete research being put out, then what you have is an incomplete picture of Christianity. So let us begin here where he begins to talk about the purveyors of myopia. I hope that you all have something to drink today. Show you my message for today. This is my message for everybody, okay? All right. Why has such a simple point been resisted? There is a dismal and ironic reason. Many modern interpreters of Africa have been tendentiously shaped by Euro-American academic conjectures. In seeking the anticipated legitimacy that comes from higher education, African scholars during the period in which independence was being fought for fell all too easily into the trap of idealizing, romanticizing, and liberalizing motifs so familiar to Western modern traditions. If you can see and hear me clearly, put some hearts on the screen. Hopefully it's not still doing that. If you can see and hear me clearly. All right. I know I was having problems with YouTube earlier, which is why I'm not using the YouTube today. All right. Good morning to beloved. Good morning, Lady Barbara and Pastor Ben, and each of you are with us on today. So, again, African scholars during the period in which their independence was being fought for fell all too easily into the trap of idealizing, romanticizing, and liberalizing motifs so familiar to Western modern traditions. They are not to be criticized for seeking the best education available to them, but the best education available to them was still highly imperfect, with all the limitations of the chief failures of modernity. Good morning, Lady Judy. Autonomous individualism, hedonistic narcissism, moral relativism, and reductive naturalism. None are characteristic of the African spirit. We can hardly find these prejudices against Africa voiced anywhere in Christian history until we get to the 19th century, especially to the writings of the French Enlightenment, German idealism, and British empiricism. It was not until Hegel, Troeltsch, Harnack, and Bauer that these prejudices became so standardized that they were accepted without question by educated Westerners and by Western educated Africans. These were the main catalysts followed not only by the Western liberals, but oddly also by the Catholic and evangelical traditions of historical scholarship. So remember, on Tuesday, we began to talk about the origins of racist ideas and how that one guy's book, Zarara, right, began to spread this doctrine all over the world that Africans were not human and that they were deserving of a place of enslavement. Now you have again, all right, an incomplete history being passed all over the world about the foundations of the faith, which is then picked up by the Catholics, who then, because everyone else, the Protestants, come out of the Catholics, they continue that tradition down through the evangelical traditions of scholarship. So this is what I keep trying to say, and I've said this before on some different broadcasts with some other friends. Anytime you start something in error, all right, it's going to trickle down to everything that comes after it. So if I started with a misrepresentation of something, until I first fix that misrepresentation, anybody who comes after that and builds upon that initial foundation is going to get error. Error is going to beget error. All right. And so when we think about that, even in the context of Pentecostalism, even in the context of some of the things that we learned, right? We're going to have to unlearn some things. You will have to unlearn some things because it was built on a foundation of either incompleteness or plain flat out falsehoods. All right. And so you need to understand that as you move forward as a believer. What we are seeing happening right now is we're seeing people repeat the same errors of the previous generation. Why? Because the previous generation received error. So that's what they passed down. Not saying that everything they received was wrong, but if you receive wrong information or you received incomplete information, it is now up to you as a believer to take the time to educate yourself, to go back and to fill in the gaps and find out what happened here, which is what we're doing today. All right. The main distortions prevailing in modern African theology have their roots in the Eurocentric traditions that penetrated deeply into the assumptions of Bauer, Bultmann, and Tillich. The extensive historical studies of these German theologians were not corrected. All right? They weren't corrected by British or American historical theologians. They have regrettably stood as normative for many liberals, evangelicals, and Catholics. Along the way, modern theology has lost track of the revered early African assessment of the saints and the martyrs and confessors. The African ancestors were viewed as myths to be demythologized, not as valued social communitarian realities. Why have these dynamics not been better understood? The historical answer is that Euro-American intellectuals have transmitted these ideas to Africa, where they have been camouflaged as if to assume that these prejudices were themselves genuinely African. Here's a crucial test question. Compare these two lists. Number one, Rousseau, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, and number two, Tertullian, Cyprian, Athanasius, Augustine. Now ask which list is more African. Now ask which list has more deeply affected the past generation of the African intelligentsia and of scholarship in and about Africa, and even of much African theology. A review of references in their books will show that the African list is quoted far less frequently by a huge factor than the European list. It is thus evident how far African interpreters have gone in accommodating to European thinkers with minimal empathy for their own African sensibilities, metaphors, and premises. When we read modern works purporting to be African theology, this is why we find Rousseau, Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud quoted far more frequently than Tertullian, Cyprian, Athanasius, or Augustine, who were actual Africans. The former list contains key names that gained increasing clout during the peace and justice movement of the 1960s that fueled the anger and resentment of the nationalistic critics against Christianity in Africa. Regrettably, the ecumenical leaders who should have been grounded in ancient ecumenical teaching offered the pretense that the modern ecumenical movement was now to be grounded in post-Enlightenment modernism, not the consensus of their own African apostolic witnesses. These pseudo-ecumenists undermined the weakened, liberalizing mainstream Protestant missions of the churches in the villages of Africa. Some then became compulsively ashamed of the apostolic witness and actively accommodative to modern Euro-American faddism. Had they been more classically African and less narrowly European in their advocacy, they would have served the ecumenical cause in Africa better than they did. So what happens? You have African church fathers who are pretty much kind of put on the shelf, right? And then you have Christian missionaries who have been Europeanized. They go back into Africa. And rather than refer to the African fathers that would have linked the native Africans they were witnessing to their own African church fathers and heritage, they Europeanized them. They westernized them. And this is why when my friends go on mission trips to Africa and they're filming and they're taking pictures of the billboards, they are astonished at how much the white Jesus image has flooded Africa. All right? And think about that. Jesus came out of Africa black. Let me sip my coffee. I want you to think about that. Jesus came out of Africa a black man. But when he returns to Africa through Western missionaries, he is represented as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Kenny Loggins lookalike. And that image has been received and accepted. And if you go over to Africa and you're looking at their billboards where they have a Christian event or something about Jesus, you're going to see Kenny Loggins on their billboards. All right. And that is a problem. I don't care what anybody says about it. That's a problem because you have now detached a savior that they should be able to identify with. You have detached him from his true identity. Okay. Has nothing to do with why do we want Jesus to be black. It has to do with the truth. The truth is he was an African Messiah. We can't erase that fact, but there are people doing it all the time. The African seedbed hypothesis requires textual demonstration. A new task is now incumbent upon emerging African Christianity to embrace its own brilliant intellectual heritage, to reclaim what is rightfully its own. This can only be done properly by showing through critical analysis how this forgetfulness has occurred, and through hard evidence how the facts confirm the extraordinary intellectual generativity of early African believers. There need be no apologies, only factual clarity leading toward verification. Let the data speak louder than the prejudices. I like that. Hashtag data over prejudice. But this evidence has not yet been persuasively stated to a global audience in a convincing way. My core hypothesis is that much intellectual history flowed south to north, from Numidia to Sicily to France and then Italy. It flowed from the Nile to the Euphrates and the Danube. It flowed from Pelusium to Gaza to Cappadocia. An unfinished task of the coming era of African scholarship is to set forth this intermediary evidence archaeologically and paleographically. There is ample evidence available that the seeds of African orthodoxy have been lifted high by high winds to distant northern climates. Only much later have they returned to Africa under a Western guise. These channels must be tracked textually. While there are centuries of research that have been devoted to European influence on Africa, there remains a dearth of research on the impact of intellectual movements from Africa to Europe. This is a question that has been lying fallow for a very long time. This problem may await some future decade to be undertaken, but it will be undertaken eventually. The evidence is already there and consistently understated. Much more will begin to be uncovered by diligent inquiry. The crisis of African theological identity may be just the catalyst to cue off this rediscovery. This evidence will be more convincing if presented by African scholars. Insofar as it has the appearance of being an instrument of Western power, it will be easily and rightly dismissed. The evidence can be dug out by anyone, but its public presentation needs an African voice. The evidence belongs to global Christianity. Its messengers must protect it from being distorted or prematurely snubbed out. Case in point, the circuitous path from Africa to Ireland to Europe and then back to Africa. The Christianity that was once indigenously present throughout North Africa was forced to flee from Vandal and Arab invasions. These refugees were exiled and became implanted in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries in the following places: Spain, Gaul, Sardinia, Sicily, Italy, and Britain. Their influence spread largely through quiet, inconspicuous, scholarly monastic communities formed under Pachomian and Augustinian rules out of Egypt and Numidia. The best example is the unexpected trajectory of monasticism that happened and went from Africa to Ireland, then to Europe, and then back to Africa in a 1,000-year cycle. This is the next step of our investigation: how Africa influenced Ireland and how the Irish monks then shaped the formation of medieval Europe. The history of the planting of African monasticism in Ireland is one of the most astonishing of all the stories of the preservation of civilization. The trajectory was from Africa to Sicily to the Isle of Lérins to Ireland. This transit happened before the Arab conquest, but its consequences became critical only after the Arab conquest. The tiny island of Lérins, just off the southern French coast, played a decisive role. There, as early as the Council of Ephesus, 431, the African-influenced monastics were spreading the Pachomian pattern of monasticism from Africa to Europe. These monastics were the following: Honoratus, Caesarius of Arles, Salvian of Marseille, and Vincent of Lérins. They set the stage for the coming of Irish monks to Europe. It may be that Patrick of Ireland was among these monks who studied at Lérins, as the ancient tradition suggests, a hypothesis that invites revisiting. How the Irish would take the lead in this movement is itself a longer story than I can tell here, but it has been told winsomely by Thomas Cahill in How the Irish Saved Civilization. The threads of evidence of African liturgical and exegetical influence in Ireland need to be carefully unpacked by astute historians who know the pertinent languages, Coptic, Gaelic, Latin, and French, and have sufficient access to the archival collections scattered throughout the Mediterranean, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and the universities and monasteries of Europe. This is a daunting task into primary source documentation. If undertaken by young African scholars, it will take on a deeper plausibility for Africans. If undertaken exclusively by the Northern Hemisphere investigators, it is more likely to be tainted with the marks of post-Enlightenment historiography. Ideally, it should be an international consortium of scholars, which is what the website on early African Christianity seeks to encourage and supply with a steady flow of active research information. The period of the 5th through 10th centuries, though very lively, is still dubbed the Dark Ages. This says more about our darkness than about the events happening at the time. A shroud of obscurity hangs over Western culture during these times. These centuries are least studied, with less empathy and less textual information than any others of Western history. I wonder why. Perhaps because the Dark Ages had to do with what they were learning from the dark people. For decades since Edmund Gibbon, they have been stereotyped as a period of vast cultural deterioration. The heart of the evidentiary task is to show the path of monastic piety and African scholarship from the Nile to the Majerta valleys in flight north to Sardinia, Sicily, Europe, and especially Ireland. Who besides the Irish will take up this astonishing investigation? Why not Africans? By the time of Columbo and Finian, the centers of monastic learning had shifted from Africa to Ireland, and from there they migrated to the Rhine Valley in Italy and the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, and finally to the Po and Rhone valleys of northern Italy and southern France in a great clockwise circular movement. The most surprising chapter of the story, however, is the return to Africa of classic Christianity, that same early ecumenical Christianity that was formed in Africa. By the time the mutations that occurred in Europe made it unrecognizable as African. So the exegesis, the theology, and the liturgy that were first refined in Africa finally returned to Africa in the prayer books and penitential practices of both Catholics and Protestants, but in forms that seemed unrecognizable as their African origin. Indeed, by the time it returned, it seemed alien to Africa, like Odysseus reclaiming his bed. It is easy to establish this path from Ireland on. What is harder to establish is the path from Majerta monasticism, fleeing from Vandal Africa to the havens of nearby Sicily, Sardinia, Provence, and Navarre, and in due course arriving along with Patrick, also known as St. Patrick, on Irish shores. This is the hazardous path traveled mainly by those monks fleeing first the Arian Vandals who brought them misery, and then from the Arabs who brought them the choice of exile, death, or slavery. This unexpected trajectory proved to be the seeding of medieval Christianity, Western law, and ultimately of Western democracy and their teachings of human dignity. All the marks of special providence appear to be classic Christian theologians to be embedded in this strange and surprising path. There is little doubt that Irish Christianity sustains strong African motifs in all of its movements. This can be seen in its crosses, in its funerary objects, in their design, in their calendars, and in their art forms, as well as in their poetry, their song, and their preaching. But to establish this requires a thorough reassessment of received texts that are known but not yet adequately assessed critically as to their stem. All this waits. Much of it must be done in Ireland, a good place for emerging African scholars to consider for advanced studies in history. This is why a bold generation of dedicated scholarship is needed in order to join the dots together. If the links can be persuasively shown, the south to north hypothesis will spring more plausibly to life. If so, many related issues of African identity and African influence on Europe will need to be re-evaluated. African intellectual history has no need to be defensive or self-effacing. We are learning that Africa taught Europe before Europe was prepared to teach Africa. Europe has slept for many centuries without being fully aware of its vital intellectual sources found in Africa. It would be a vast exaggeration to claim that African theology became normative for all aspects of ancient Christianity. But it is not an exaggeration to say that African exegetical skills and competencies in interpreting the Old Testament provided the pattern by which Africans, especially Origen, Augustine, and Cyril, supplied the scriptural basis for the work of the Cappadocians, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa to Gregory the Great. This exegetical achievement was such that few aspects of early ecumenical theology will be found untouched by African exegesis. So, if you ask, from what continent did the great fathers of ecumenical orthodoxy get the core of their scriptural interpretation? The answer has to be more of it comes from African texts than European. From where did John of Damascus get his vision of orthodoxy? More from Athanasius and Cyril than any European. From where did Leo the Great get the Chalcedonian formulation? The roots are mostly African, from the exegetes of the Nile and Majerta. The temptation to exaggerate is intrinsic to all scholarship. Rare is the scholar who does not think that his or her own subject matter is the most important. Historical influences are far easier to allege than to demonstrate. The study of history begs for a humble and contrite heart. The Afrocentric exaggeration that has tainted this inquiry must be overcome by evidence. The challenge for young African scholars is to dig into these areas and examine the hypotheses suggested to see indeed if they are defensible in terms of the evidence. So, next week, Lord willing, we will be on chapter 4 and we'll be talking about one faith, two Africas. One faith, two Africas. So I find it very interesting that African Christianity would skip right on over to Ireland, and then from Ireland go to Europe, and then from Europe come back to Africa, and then from Africa go into the Americas. I don't know about anybody else, but I find that pretty interesting. Why do I find that interesting? Because the Ku Klux Klan has their origins from the Irish. But that's another topic. All right. We are in the cross and the lynching tree now. And we are looking at the terrible beauty of the cross. And we are talking about the author here, the professor, James Cone, challenging Reinhold Niebuhr's assessment of the cross. Again, many people see him as the father of most Western theology. And Cohen is making the point now that for him to have been the father of most of what people consider to be Western thought on theology, he's finding it very interesting that Reinhold Niebuhr never made the connection between the experience of the cross and lynching of Black people in America. So that is where we are right now. The wise, the mighty, and the noble are condemned because their status in society tempts them to think too highly of their knowledge, power, and heritage. Mary's song, the Magnificat, makes a similar point. He hath put down the mighty from their seats and exalted them of low degree. Jesus in the Gospels repeatedly makes the same claim. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Or, as Niebuhr put it, the Christian faith is centered in one who was born in a manger and who died upon the cross. This is really the source of the Christian transvaluation of all values. The Christian knows that the cross is the truth. In that standard, he sees the ultimate success of what the world calls failure and failure of what the world calls success. The cross is the truth because God is hidden there in Jesus' sacrificial, vicarious suffering. Only faith can see that which cannot be derived from the logic of history or reason. Faith is able to sense and appropriate an ultimate truth too deep for human reason. This faith is defined by humility and repentance. People without imagination, Niebuhr said, really have no right to write about ultimate things. Certainly, it takes a special kind of imagination to understand the truth of the cross. Ultimate religious truth, Niebuhr wrote, can be grasped only in symbolic form, and the Christ of the cross is the supreme symbol of divine grace. For that reason, Niebuhr said, only poets can do justice to the Christmas and Easter stories, and there are not many poets in the pulpit. In an article from 1929, he displayed his own capacity for that kind of poetic language when he speaks of the terrible beauty of the cross, an artful phrase that highlights the paradox of the cross, its power and futility. One needs a powerful imagination to see both tragedy and beauty, futility and redemption in the cross. Christianity is a faith, he wrote, which takes us through tragedy to beyond tragedy by way of the cross to victory in the cross. Few could speak with such eloquence about the cross as Reinhold Niebuhr. When I read his sermons and other theological reflections on the cross, I could almost be listening to a Black preacher who can take a congregation through the power of imagination to the foot of Jesus' cross. I can see him as he mounted Calvary and hung upon the cross for our sins. I can see the mountains fall to their rocky knees, and when he cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And about that time, Jesus groaned on the cross, dropped his head in the locks of his shoulder, and said, it is finished, it is finished. Niebuhr writes with a similar poetic imagination, using symbols and myths to tell the terrible truth about the salvation offered in the cross to all who accept with a faith defined by humility and repentance. And yet, in the end, was there not a limit to Niebuhr's imagination? For all his exquisite sensitivity to symbols, analogies, and the moral dimensions of history, he was ultimately blind to the most obvious symbolic reenactment of the crucifixion in his own time. Niebuhr's focus on realism, or the facts of experience, and the cross, tragedy, should have turned his gaze to the lynching tree, but he did not look there, even though lynching trees were widely scattered throughout the American landscape. Why did Niebuhr fail to connect Jesus' cross to the most obvious cross bearers in American society, the lynched Negro? Niebuhr has a complex perspective on race, at once honest and ambivalent, radical and moderate. On the one hand, he says that, quote, in the matter of race, we are only a little better than the Nazis. And on the other, he is urging, quote, sympathy for anxious white parents who are opposed to unsegregated schools. In terms almost as severe as those of Malcolm X, Niebuhr speaks about God's judgment on America. He calls, quote, racial hatred the most vicious of all human vices, the dark and terrible abyss of evil in the soul of man, a form of original sin, the most persistent of all collective evils, more stubborn than class prejudice, and the gravest social evil in our nation. If, he concluded, the white man were to expiate his sins committed against the darker races, few white men would have a right to live. But unlike Malcolm, Niebuhr also says that the founding fathers, despite being slaveholders, were, quote, virtuous and honorable men and certainly no villains. They merely bowed to the need for establishing national unity based on a common race and common language. He even says that the 1896 Supreme Court doctrine of separate but equal, which made Jim Crow segregation legal in the South, was, quote, a very good doctrine for its day, since it allowed the gifted members among ex-slaves, a culturally backward people, to show, as a few had done in sports and the arts, irrefutable proof that these deficiencies were not due to innate inferiorities. In my view, these latter views amount to a moral justification of slavery and Jim Crow. So much for Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr praised the 1954 Supreme Court decision ending segregation in public schools, which he claimed, quote, initiated the first step in the Negro Revolt. Yet he was also pleased by the court's added phrase, with all deliberate speed, which wisely gave the white South time to adjust, while also opening a loophole to delay integration. The Negroes, Niebuhr said, will have to exercise patience and be sustained by a robust faith that history will gradually fulfill the logic of justice. Now, let's talk about that statement for a moment. Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the greatest theologian minds for the Western thought, said, history will gradually fulfill the logic of justice. In other words, justice will work itself out in time. If you have not seen that happen, put some hearts on the screen. Has justice just worked itself out in time? Or has there actually been people who have been actively working for justice? Niebuhr's call for gradualism, patience, and prudence during the decade when Willie McGee, 1951, Emmett Till, 1955, and MC Mac Parker, 1959, and other blacks were lynched sounds like that of a Southern moderate, more concerned about not challenging the cultural traditions of the white South than achieving justice for black people. He cited the distinguished novelist William Faulkner in Harding Carter, a Mississippi journalist with a long record of fairness on the race issue, in defense of gradualism, patience, and prudence, so as not to push the Southern white people off balance, even though he realized that blacks were understandably smarting under such a long history of injustice. We can hardly blame Negroes for being impatient with the counsel for patience in view of their age-long suffering under the white man's arrogance. Yet, Niebuhr continued in the same essay, the fact that it is not very appealing to the victims of a current injustice does not make it any less the course of wisdom in overcoming historic injustices. Niebuhr chose to listen to Southern moderates like Faulkner and Carter on race, rather than to civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who regarded Faulkner's counsel to go slow and pause for a moment as a tranquilizing drug of gradualism. It is hardly a moral act to encourage others patiently to accept injustice which he himself does not endure, King wrote. Because Niebuhr identified with white moderates in the South more than with their black victims, he could not really feel their suffering as his own. When King asked him to sign a petition appealing to President Eisenhower to protect black children involved in integrating schools in the South, Niebuhr declined. Such pressure, he told his friend and Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, would do more harm than good. Niebuhr believed that white ministers from the South would be more effective. How could white ministers from the South be more effective when some of them were actual Klansmen? Let's just think about that. What accounts for the contradictions in Niebuhr's perspective on race? In part, they are due to his failure to step into black people's shoes and walk around in them. To use the words of Atticus Finch in Harper Lee's classic To Kill a Mockingbird, it was easy for Niebuhr to walk around in his own shoes as a white man and view the world from that vantage point. But it takes a whole lot of empathetic effort to step into those of black people and see the world through the eyes of African Americans. Niebuhr himself analyzed this dilemma, having persuasively pointed out in his classic Moral Man and Immoral Society that groups are notoriously selfish and have limited capacity to step outside of their interests and see the world from another group's standpoint. The will to survive is so strong that it transmutes easily into the will to power. Niebuhr expands on this point in the first volume of his masterpiece, The Nature and Destiny of Man. All human beings are finite and free. Our freedom creates anxiety and insecurity, causing us both as individuals and as groups to seek security among our own kind through various forms of power over others in politics, religion, and knowledge. Groups use both religion and reason to advance their own interests and find it nearly impossible to, quote, feel the pain of others as vividly as they do their own. From a rational and intellectual standpoint, however, Niebuhr did attempt to walk in black people's shoes, recognizing how they had been the victims of white racist violence throughout American history. He knew about the brutality of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and lynching. When he was a pastor in Detroit, the Ku Klux Klan was very active politically, nearly capturing the mayor's office there in 1925. There was a near lynching the same year when Ossian Sweet, a black dentist, bought a house in a white neighborhood and nearly caused a riot after he and a few relatives and friends moved into the dwelling. When a crowd of hundreds of whites assembled, throwing rocks and threatening the occupants, Sweet's brother Henry panicked and shot and killed the white man. That led to the arrest of all 11 occupants who were subsequently charged with murder. During the first trial, with Clarence Darrow as the lead defense attorney, the jury could not reach a decision. But in the second trial, that involved only the shooter, Darrow was able to convince the jury to put themselves in Henry Sweet's shoes, and they brought back a not guilty verdict, which surprised many black and white people. What made Darrow so effective was his capacity to empathize with blacks and to persuade others to do so, arguing that blacks have as much right as whites to defend themselves when their home is under attack. Hashtag Botham Shem John. According to Niebuhr, Darrow made everyone writhe as he pictured the injustices and immoralities of our present industrial system. But Niebuhr continued, the tremendous effect of his powerful address was offset by the bitterness with which he spoke. When Niebuhr thought a little more deeply about his empathy with black suffering, however, he said, I suppose it is difficult to escape bitterness when you have eyes to see and heart to feel what others are too blind and too callous to notice. Niebuhr had eyes to see black suffering, but I believe he lacked the heart to feel it as his own. Although he wrote many essays about race, commenting on a variety of racial issues in America and in Africa and Asia, the problem of race was never one of his central theological or political concerns. It has been difficult for white people to empathize fully with the experience of black people, but it has never been impossible. In contrast to Niebuhr and other professors at Union Seminary, the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, during his year of study at Union, showed an existential interest in blacks, befriending a black student named Franklin Fisher, attending and teaching Bible study in Sunday school, and even preaching at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Bonhoeffer also read widely in African American history and literature, including Walter Wright's Rope and Faggot on the history of lynching, read about the burning of Raymond Gunn in Maryville, Missouri, in the Literary Digest, the first lynching in 1931, and expressed his outrage over the infamous Scottsboro Boys trial. He also wrote about the Negro Church, the Black Christ, and White Christ in the writings of the Black poet Countee Cullen, read Alan Locke and Langston Hughes, and regarded the spirituals as the most influential contribution made by the Negro to American Christianity. Some of Bonhoeffer's white friends wondered whether he was becoming too involved in that Negro community. Niebuhr, in contrast, showed little or no interest in engaging in dialogue with Black people about racial justice, even though he lived in Detroit during the Great Migration of Blacks from the South and in New York near Harlem, the largest concentration of Blacks in America. He attended socialist and leftist meetings when W.E.B. Du Bois and A. Philip Randolph were present, and included such writers as James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, and Countee Cullen of the Harlem Renaissance in his course, Ethical Viewpoints of Modern Literature, a course that Bonhoeffer attended. But Niebuhr cites no Black intellectuals in his writing. Wait a minute now, wait a minute. How sway? How are you around some of the greatest artists, poets, and minds in Black history today? How are you around all of these people, attending meetings, living in the very cities where the riots were happening, but you don't include no Black intellectuals in your writing? What's up with that? He repeatedly writes about, quote, our Negro minority, not our brothers, as he referred to the Jews, a phrase that suggests white paternalism. Although Niebuhr allowed his name to be used for the support committee of Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, he did not join the organization or attend any of its conferences dealing with racial justice. Sounds like we're actually repeating history with some of our current white brothers and sisters. He often used the word Negro in the lowercase at a time when the NAACP fought hard to establish its capitalization. He seemed only marginally concerned about justice for Black people, even though he firmly opposed racial prejudice in any form. Sounds like the 7,000 pastors that just signed a letter saying that social justice is not necessary or not really a part of the gospel message. It sounds just like him. Unlike his long love affair with the Jewish people, Niebuhr's lack of strong empathy for Black suffering prevented him from speaking out passionately for justice on behalf of Black people, as did Clarence Darrow and many others in the NAACP and Communist Party. He headed Mayor John Smith's interracial committee to study racial problems in Detroit and acknowledged, quote, a rare experience to meet with white and colored leaders and talk over our racial problems, which was perhaps the only time he would engage racial issues with Black and white leaders together. While serving on the Race Commission, Niebuhr saw that, quote, the situation which colored people of the city face is really a desperate one, and no one who does not spend real time in gathering facts can have any idea of the misery and pain which exists amongst these people. When Niebuhr saw suffering, he described the facts as he saw them. Thousands in this town are really living in torment while the rest of us eat, drink, and make merry. What a civilization. After Niebuhr left Detroit to teach theology and social ethics at Union Seminary in New York, a racial controversy arose at Bethel Church when two African Americans tried to join the congregation and were opposed by a significant number of members. Niebuhr's successor, Adelbert Helm, correctly insisted that racial inclusiveness was a test of the Christian identity of the church. However, when advocates on both sides of the controversy attempted to enlist Niebuhr's help, he apparently criticized the new pastor for his unpedagogical methods, which led to his dismissal. While Niebuhr was no supporter of racism, he stated, I never envisaged a fully developed interracial church at Bethel. I do not think we are ready for that, he wrote in a letter to the church council at Bethel. He contended that no congregation at the present time is ready to face the ultimate test. But Niebuhr continued, I do not see how any church can be so completely disloyal to the gospel of love as to put up bars against members of another racial group who apply for inclusion in its fellowship. We're going to stop right there. So what you're hearing is really, to me, the indecisiveness of Reinhold Niebuhr to make up his mind about how he felt about black people. We're going to continue that on next week. We're still in the terrible beauty of the cross. And I'm really glad that James Cone is laying it out for us so that he's really giving us a demonstration of something that has continued in our society to this day. And that is an indecisiveness amongst some of our white brothers and sisters, especially white religious leaders, about how they feel about black people. Yes, because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth was speaking. To me, it was speaking very loud and clear. I accept you as being a Christian, but I don't know if I necessarily want you in my space. I don't know if I necessarily want to include you. And I certainly don't see your suffering as our suffering. Yeah, there was a heart issue there. Because if you can separate it and you keep separating out the pain of Black America as their pain and not our pain, then that means that there is something in your mind that's disconnecting the pain of Black people from the humanity of all people. All right. So that is something that I think we as a body of believers needs to think about. Why do Christian leaders continue to separate out Black people's pain as if it is not something that should concern everybody? And this was like 1920s, 1930s, all right? And you still see the same mindset. So my question now is it a spirit? The privileged want to stay privileged in all areas. Exactly. Is it a spirit, or is it taught, learned behavior that continues to be passed down to generations of white children who then grow up to be Christians like Reinhold Niebuhr that don't see the connection between what is happening in the Black community affects everybody? It's not just our problem. It's really not. It's a problem of humanity. And what was it? As I close, earlier this week, we took a chance on a movie because these days I don't watch everything. We went to go see this movie called White Boy Rick. And it was about a white family who had gotten caught up in the drug dealing in Detroit in the 80s at the height of the crack drug epidemic. And the thing that struck me the most about that movie was it could have been any Black drug dealing movie that came out, like Boys in the Hood. I don't know all of them, but there was a series of movies, about South Central LA and the drug culture that was happening with Black people and how young boys were getting killed, shot up over drug and gang stuff, right? Except this movie was taken from the perspective of lower class white people and how they got caught up in the drug issues of Detroit in the 80s. And what was really interesting to me was at the end of this movie, there were lots of white people in the movie theater, but they were there silently crying about this guy's life. I mean, and White Boy Rick is based on a true story. He's actually out of prison now because they had given him life in prison, and he became the longest serving non-violent drug offender in the history of Michigan, right? But I noticed that people were just sitting in the movie theater quietly crying about this white boy this young white teenager, 15 years old, who had gotten caught up in the drug culture of Detroit. And they were really affected by it. They were really moved by it. And I looked at my husband and I said, maybe I'm not really that moved by this film because we have seen this over and over again. Like, it has been presented to our community in film over and over and over and over and over and over again. And I'm quite sure there'll be more films that try to present the drug gang culture of Black America. But I recognize and I realize that maybe this is probably the first time that they're actually experiencing what the Black community in this aspect of drugs and crime and how it affects young lives and Black teenagers. They're probably finally just getting the idea of the tragedy of young Black people's lives being taken out by drugs. But it's just from their perspective. And so that was really eye-opening for me. Like, wow, they really can actually show compassion on this topic when it's a young white 15-year-old boy that's being portrayed in the same manner as many films have portrayed young African-American teenage Black boys who get caught up in the drug culture. So, very eye-opening film, very eye-opening movie, and also very eye-opening response to the film. I said all that to say, we got to work on our empathy. They may be thinking about their drug-addicted relatives. Also, yes, because some of that was portrayed in the film. But we have drug-addicted relatives too. That's what I'm saying. And I don't really see people feeling sorry for our drug-addicted relatives. I see them saying, we deserve whatever we're going to get, which is a totally different mindset of these people need treatment. They are addicted to something and they need treatment. That's generally the response we get when we hear about people who are addicted to opioids. They need help. They need treatment. Let's get them some help. When you hear about Black people addicted to crack, we say they need jail. They need jail. They need to stop stealing. They need to get off the streets. Like, the whole mindset is completely different. And that's what I think James Cone is trying to show us in terms of belief and in terms of faith, that the same compassion you would have for somebody that looks like you is the same compassion you should have for someone who doesn't look like you, because we're all a part of humanity. So, this has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I've been your host today, Shantae Charles. I want to thank you again for your time and attention. I know on Thursdays we get a little bit more into scholarly talk, but I believe that these books are important for us to understand what has happened in the past, how it's affecting us now, what are some theological beliefs and positions that people hold in the past that people are still dragging into the present. All right. And so sometimes we're trying to figure out, where do these thought processes come? Where did this mindset come from? And we are slowly but surely finding out. Again, I want to thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for hanging in with us today. I will upload this video, Lord willing, onto my YouTube channel. So it'll be there, as well as my Facebook page. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light. Thank you again. Take care and God bless.